This video is for Cal Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class, Plan Making, History and Future. Today's presentation will be on the textbook Urban Land Use Planning by Berke, Godschalk, Kaiser, and Rodriguez. This is on Chapter 7, Land Use Systems, and my name is Professor Scott Reimers. So the authors, in talking about land use systems, talk about three different groups of people who influence land use decisions: developers, local government, and community interest groups. Developers have a basic desire to change land, and that can be the use of the land or it could be the density of the land. So a change in use would be from agriculture to residential, or it could be from a residential use to a mixed use development, or taking a defunct kind of rundown power center and turning it into a mixed use building. That would be a change in land use. But they might also just be looking at an increase in land use density. So changing it from a single family lot to a duplex or a triplex, or from a triplex to an apartment building, or taking a small store with some parking in the back, demolishing that and replacing it with a power center. Those would be changes to land use density. So these developers and real estate agents and all their connected groups are looking to change those land uses. And through that, they're hoping to make a profit. They do that by looking at underutilized properties and increasing the utility of those properties. They are really the engine that drives urban development. They're the ones who are pushing urban development and creating that change. But don't think of it just as land use developers, but also think that this might also include affordable housing developers and nonprofits. So the next group that the authors talk about is local government. And the basic job of government is to manage change over time. So that management of change could involve environmental regulations. It could be to ensure that there's infrastructure. It could be to look at traffic patterns, but it's to create the basic framework of land use changes and ensure that it's mitigating or reducing impacts to the extent possible. Now, the local government here is the primary player. The federal government and the state government typically play a role, but in the United States, those roles are much smaller in comparison to the local government. The federal government would have programs and policies related to housing and urban development, where they might be looking at providing for affordable housing, or it could be through the Environmental Protection Agency and NEPA, or it could be through state government. And through the state government, you would see even more control. You would see maybe the state government enrolled in, for instance, in the state of California, we have our own set of environmental regulations through the California Environmental Quality Act. But we've also seen the state of California taking on an even larger role than it has historically and has passed bills that allow for accessory dwelling unit development, density bonus laws, and things like that. In some states, they even set up urban growth boundaries that have an effect over a number of cities. So the authors state that within local government, there's generally three different types of governments or local governments. One would be one that's pro-growth, then managed growth, and no growth. There's a spectrum here. You can't just say, well, this city is decidedly one or the other. But pro-growth cities generally would allow for more growth to occur. So they would have, for instance, higher floor area ratio standards probably. They would be setting up less barriers to development, maybe actively tearing down barriers to development, and most likely are going out and promoting development. So these are cities who have economic development managers who are going out to bring in development. They might be doing specific plan developments, specific plan documents to see if they can promote development that way. Managed growth cities, well, the extreme opposite of that would be a no-growth city, and those are cities that are actively setting up barriers to development. So they might be downzoning, they might be setting up additional standards and requirements, or they just might be cities that tend to say no to permits for development. And then managed growth is going to be somewhere in between the two of those. Land use influencers are community groups, community interest groups. And these community interest groups can be quite a range depending on either the size of the city or how much planning kind of has a history within that city. The first would be neighborhood associations. When I was working in Pasadena, we had a lot of different neighborhood associations. And they even had an office within the city that helped create a connection between the staff and the different neighborhood associations. You have environmental groups, and you might have a group of the Sierra Club or just a group of environmentally oriented citizens. In Pasadena, we had a tree preservation group. You might also have a group of people who are advocates for affordable housing, or a group of people who are advocates for labor unions, or even the Chamber of Commerce. Now, these groups, the sense is that they're generally against development, but as I mentioned, some of those different types of community interest groups might be pro-development. Your Chamber of Commerce, your labor unions. You might have a downtown neighborhood association that's more supportive of development than the ones who are in kind of your higher end suburbs. Generally, these neighbors that are expressing concern about projects are going to be expressing concern about things like height, privacy, parking. What's the impact going to be on schools? How much more traffic congestion is there going to be? That was this section on land use interest groups. This next section of the textbook is on land use maintenance, conversion, development, and redevelopment. When looking at that, it's often seen that conflicts over land use and how those conflicts play out can depend on where that land use change is occurring. Is it changing in an agricultural area or in a suburban area and in an urban area? And within each of those areas, you can have local governments that have a different position on growth, whether they're looking at managing growth or whether it's a no growth community. I wanted to focus just quickly on different ways that local agencies can set up programs that have a no growth impact. Now, as I go through these, it's important to note that some of these are good tools. However, it's also important to know that they can have a no growth or a managed growth or a reduction in growth sort of impact on that community. The first would be a historic preservation program or overlay. Historic preservation is a good thing, but those overlays can sometimes limit the amount of growth in a community, depending on how they're set up and managed. They can zone areas specifically for stability to protect them. That's a common thing in many suburban areas of California. Cities want to, for instance, protect single-family neighborhoods, and so they would have zoning to create stability within those communities. You can have neighborhood preservation overlays. You could have cities that refuse to upgrade infrastructure, or they just can't afford to upgrade infrastructure or update public facilities, and thereby that limits growth. You can have cities that are trying to protect environmental areas, and that's a good thing. But by doing that, they're constraining development. They're not allowing development in wetland areas, perhaps. Some cities have limits on the number of permits they're going to issue, or a growth cap. I remember in Pasadena, they had a cap on how many units they would allow to be built every year. And the city would go through and basically have auction them off in a way that you'd have to apply to use those units. The staff would rate the different applications and then recommend that so many projects got built. So the city was kind of picking and choosing which projects they wanted to be built based on how well each project met the city's goals. Over time, that system changed. That was called the Growth Management Initiative. Over time, that changed into a series of specific plans that had a cap on growth within each. And then lastly, some cities develop what are called urban growth boundaries that say urban growth is going to be constrained within this geographic area. So as I had mentioned before, as development occurs, there is conflict that's going to happen, and how that conflict plays out depends a little bit on what type of area that conflict occurs in. So what I mean by that is, if you have a rural area where growth is slowly occurring over time, in those types of areas, I don't know this by fact because I never worked in one, we're told that neighbors work out their issues. The two neighbors come together and they try to work out issues on a one-to-one basis. The next type of area would be a rural area that's kind of rapidly growing. You think of Chino or Chino Hills, where the cattle ranches were turning over very quickly into single-family developments. In those places, it's not neighbors working issues out between each other. Instead, it's elected officials creating a set of zoning laws or reviewing specific plans for these developments. And then you have infill areas. This is what most of the San Gabriel Valley would be right now. In these areas, you do have those zoning laws that exist, but you're more likely to have a lot of conflict over very small projects, where sometimes either the city council or the planning commission and even beyond that, judges have to mediate those land use planning issues. So as we're talking about how land use is converted and what is that process of redevelopment, there's two general opposing directions on how development can occur. One is greenfield development, when you're taking an area that either is a farm or has never been farmed. It's just feral land. And so that's greenfield development, when you're taking those areas and you're turning it into new development. And opposed to that is infill development. And that's when you're taking an area that had previously been developed with buildings and then you're inputting new uses that are more intensive. So the benefit of greenfield development is that it's fast. It tends to be much faster than doing infill development. Building a single family house is just really super quick in comparison to building a 5-story or 10-story building. The other benefit is that there's a lot less community opposition when you don't have, a lot of neighbors nearby. When there's only one or two neighbors, it's easier to work those issues out. And that's probably also feeds into that it's a faster process. But infill development does come with a lot of other benefits that we don't see in greenfield development. And that infill development helps save public funds. So you're not building out a whole new water line, miles out in order to provide the infrastructure that's needed. You're not building out all these sewer systems, and not just building them, but then maintaining them, which ends up becoming a huge cost for local governments. If you can build in areas where there's already infrastructure in place, that makes development and use and maintenance of that infrastructure more efficient. So it also reduces impact on agriculture and sensitive lands. So you're not building on prime agriculture land, and you're not building on wetlands. It helps support public transit. So if you're building out and creating a lot of sprawl where the areas are low density, that's not going to be very supportive of public transit. Another benefit of infill is that it moves middle-income people and upper-income people into challenged neighborhoods. So you're creating a diversity of different people in different income brackets, which can be good, although that can lead to gentrification issues. So it's important in infill communities to have in place protections for gentrification issues. There also can cause traffic congestion. When you bring a lot more density into an area, you're going to increase congestion. So you're either going to need to mitigate that or focus on vehicle miles traveled, which is less focused on congestion and more focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then lastly, there are going to come with infill projects issues about density that people have with density and compatibility between new and existing structures. So enough of the players, the interest groups, and the process. Let's get into the actual land use systems. So if you're developing a land use system, some different components that you're going to need data on is within your land use supply inventory are shown on the slide here. And what I mean by a land supply inventory is generally it's like a huge spreadsheet, if you think of it that way, with a number of columns and rows. Each row is information on a separate parcel. Generally, we do it by parcel of land. And then each column is a different characteristic of that land. And so you would use these spreadsheets in a number of different ways as you start looking at different land use scenarios. So this land use system needs a certain amount of existing data within its inventory. So you're first of all going to need to know the type of land use. So what's on there presently? What's going on? Is it retail? Is it a service-oriented use? Is it residential? Is it commercial? And that's information you can get usually from the county. But often the county's records are old in that the records are not updated unless the property is reevaluated. And so sometimes you need to double check that the information is correct when using county data. Another way of going about that is by using your own data from business license records. In addition to that, another category you'd be interested in terms of land use is location. And then again, this is typically your assessor parcel number. Assessor parcel numbers are a 4-digit number, followed by a 2-digit number, followed by another 4-digit number. So the first 4 digits are for your map book, then your 2-digit number is for your map page, and then the 4 digits after that are for the actual parcel number. So that's your APN or assessor parcel number. You're going to want to know what is the square footage of the improvements on that property. How many square feet is the building on that property? What services are on the property? Is there infrastructure that's available or not available? Is there water? Is there sewer? All of those types of things. What is the condition of the building on the structure? And this is something that can be hard to determine through the housing element process. For instance, the state wants you to look at the condition of structures in a community. If a lot of structures are uninhabitable or in disrepair, you're going to want to develop some policies and programs to help bring those into a state of repair. So you have to do a land survey to go out and look at the condition of the properties in that area. Timing. Your agency might have limits on timing of development. You'd want to include that in your land use inventory. You might have constraints such as areas that are within a certain habitat or areas that have a high slope or are in a liquefaction area or in a floodplain. If your parcel is within one of those areas, you'd want to note that in your land use supply inventory. And then lastly, cost. And this is typically provided by your county, and that's going to provide the assessed value of the land. Now, again, due to Prop 13 in the state of California, the assessed valuation of the property is only revised when the property sells. So the property hasn't sold in 30 years, that assessed value is going to be very low. So the authors bring up another way of classifying land, and this is through the urban transect model. This is just a visual way of classifying land in an area. There it divides it into the first section would be your rural area, and your rural area, the rural area would include 2 different types of areas. You'd have the rural preserve and the rural reserve. The preserve is areas that are legally protected. So these are legally protected wetlands or a national forest. The second is the rural reserve. These are areas that are not protected by development, but maybe should be due to floodplains or steep slopes or aquifer recharge. You then also would have just a standard agricultural area where you're allowing the growth of different plants. And then you'd have the suburban area. And so the suburban area is this area shown here. Here you have, it's the least residentially dense area. You have single family detached housing. The next area is what's called the general urban area. The general urban area is primarily residential, but you're looking at small and medium-sized lots. The next would be the urban center. The urban center is a fully mixed-use area. So you're going to have apartments likely on the side streets, and then on your major streets you're going to have commercial buildings. And then the last area, which you can't see because my head's in the way, is the urban core, and that's the densest area where you're finding mostly commercial buildings. But we're seeing that change now. The urban core, for instance, in Los Angeles, we're seeing a lot more residential growth in those areas. So if you're preparing a general plan or a specific plan, one thing you're going to have to do is a capacity analysis. And that's in order to tell you, you're going to identify your land, and then you're going to decide how much capacity there is in terms of growth. And so I want to walk you through that process. It is very labor intensive. I remember when we were in Pasadena, we took aside all the planners who were on staff. At the time we had about 30 planners. We broke them into groups, each responsible for a different portion of the city. And mostly it was our mixed use and our commercial areas, and had them do a parcel by parcel analysis of the different of each piece of land, and looked at what they thought the different capacity issues are. And so we'll go through that process. So the authors provide this diagram figuring out land use capacity, land use supply and land use capacity. In your textbook is figure 7-4. And what this figure is trying to do is explain how you would go through and look at what you have in terms of existing land supply. And after you look at a lot of different factors, you could develop an idea for how much net new development you might have capacity for. And what I mean by net new is not just the gross change, but based on existing development, what is the increase, the incremental increase in land use change? So let's start with the process. In terms of process, you would start with total land supply. And so you would typically do is you would reach out to your county district, and in LA County, it would be your county tax assessor and get assessor parcel data. The county of LA has its own GIS department. You can reach out to them and tell them you're looking for the county's assessor parcel information. And they will give you a CD with a massive amount of data on it, all sorted by parcel. From there, you then have a good starting place in total land supply. And then you might take your information that you've developed and add to that. You might add in some of the things we had talked about, such as business license information, any endangered species areas, any areas that are protected wetlands, things like that. Okay, so you've started with the total land supply. From that, you're going to take out any parcels that you consider fully developed. So if something is already at its maximum floor area ratio, you would mark that as fully developed. And in your land use model, you would say, I don't want you to project any more growth on that parcel. So for instance, in Pasadena, you might say we had areas that were, I think, at a FAR of 3.0. So in those areas, you would only allow maybe a 3-story building. But we had in prior years, decades and decades before, you might have had a building that was exceeding that floor area ratio. In that case, you would say that no development is going to occur in that area. You would also look at what's already in your development pipeline. And what that means is you might already have applications that are in process. And so you would want to add those into your total land supply. Now that you know what's being proposed, you're going to want to hard code that into your land use model. So all of that then feeds directly into your total net development capacity for some of the parcels. For some of the parcels, you know no development's going to occur. And on some parcels, you know already what the development capacity is because you've gotten applications in. For all other parcels, you're going to look at the existing land supply. And so you're going to note whether that property is vacant, whether it's partially used, or whether it's underused. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then on each of those different types of parcels, you're going to create a capacity number. Now that capacity number might be based on the floor area ratio or the density category that you're proposing in your land use scenario. So you might have a land use scenario that is changing some of the properties from agriculture to single family development, in which case you might note that as vacant land, and that vacant land is going to change to 6 units per acre. And you can figure out how many units are going to be on that site. You might have other properties where there's a small structure on a very large lot, but you're proposing to change the density in that area from 12 units per acre to 36 units per acre. So then once you hard code that information, and you could figure out what the net increase in development is. And that's what's happening here. You're pulling in all the numbers from these different types of properties into a total net increase number. So after you do all those calculations, you could figure out that maybe your area is going to grow by, or has the potential to grow by, 5,000 housing units and have an extra 1 million square feet of commercial development. There are some things you might want to take out of those scenarios. There might be deductions due to prohibitive constraints in the area. So you might have tight regulatory constraints. That could be governmental constraints that have been set up, that growth is not going to occur due to an urban growth boundary, or you're trying to preserve agricultural land or something like that. You might have infrastructure complaints. Constraints might be there's no water in that area or no sewer lines. You might have ownership constraints. For instance, if you have a small parcel of land that, or like a shopping center, and it's divided by 30 different property owners who don't get along, you might just say, well, there's an ownership constraint, and we know development's not going to occur in that area. You could have environmental constraints, physical constraints. Those would be constraints due to like maybe very steep slopes. So you don't want development to occur there. Or there just might be market-related constraints. There's something happening in the market that's not going to allow development to occur within the time horizon. And so that's a basic process for how you can go through and create some capacity numbers. Now, I've already mentioned in this lecture a few times already the idea of developing different land use scenarios. And this is a great time to do that is through a community, when you're doing community outreach. And it's important to community outreach to put together different land use scenarios. As you're going through the land use process, you'll be getting comments, and you'll be seeing the tensions that are occurring within your community. And as you see those different tensions, you might start thinking about what are some different scenarios we can develop that would show those tensions. And then through the process, you can have the community actually develop those scenarios. In Pasadena, when we updated the general plan there, we worked with 4 different sets of different commissioners, and each commissioner was assigned to one of these land use scenarios. There was a sustainability scenario, an environmental sustainability scenario, an economic development scenario, and then a reduced capacity scenario, kind of a no growth, managed growth sort of scenario. And then we went through a charrette process with the community where the commissioners would meet in the morning. We would discuss these different scenarios. We'd put pen to paper. We'd have people come in and sketch what the buildings might look like at key intersections. We do some land use analysis to determine what the impact of that development might be. And then in the evening, we'd invite the public to come out and give us input on the different scenarios. So land use scenarios, great time to do that is when you're doing community outreach and getting the community involved in that scenario creation. Another way of doing that is by using, rather than using computer systems, is using what's called the chip model. And you think of like poker chips, and each chip would designate in color a certain land use, and the number of chips would designate the density of that land use or intensity of the land use. And then you would give each table a set of chips, and then they would go through and they would move the chips into certain locations depending on what their goals are. As I had mentioned, you can take these different land use scenarios after you get initial feedback from the community, and you can input them into land use analysis and visualization tools. And so then the public can start to see, well, if we choose scenario A over scenario B, we might see these impacts. And then it's also helpful for them to see what the physical structures might look like through that process. And one of the benefits of doing this is that it helps the public see where the tensions are and what the result might be of choosing different scenarios. So in these different land use scenarios, when you're presenting them to the public, you're going to want to provide them a set of numbers and figures that help them see what the impact of that land use scenario is. And the authors refer to these as indicators. They note that the indicators should be communicated very clearly. You don't want to make it complicated for people. You want to make the presentation of information very clear. They suggest showing two variables within the same graph. And the reason why they think that is that if you can show two related variables, you can often see the impact of one variable or one variable on another, or one indicator on another. So they show, for example, in figure 7-6, they show that in an area of North Carolina, the population grew by 15%, but vehicle miles traveled went up 37%. And what that demonstrates to us as planners is pretty clear, is that while your population only grew 15%, people were driving a lot longer distances. And vehicle miles traveled, high numbers, end up leading to more greenhouse gas emissions. So what you want to see is less vehicle miles traveled per person. And so you could start to show those different indicators. And I should note that figuring out what indicators to show exactly is important, and whether to show gross figures or that indicator per person or per capita. And then in sidebar 7-3, they provide a whole long list of a number of different indicators you could use, from the most obvious, which would be population and employment numbers. But you might also do a use mix figure so that you can show the number of dissimilar uses within an area. The idea being you want a lot of dissimilar uses to reduce the length that people have to drive to get from one use to another. You might look at population density, jobs housing balance, proximity to transit. You might look at park space supply. That's one that you're going to look at probably in your environmental document anyways. Greenhouse gas emissions, and you might look at greenhouse gas emissions per capita. The amount of impervious surfaces, so surfaces that don't allow water to come to percolate. All of these, there's also bicycle network coverage, the percent of streets that have bicycle lanes or some sort of bike route. So there's a lot of different indicators you can look at and the public can use to decide which scenario they want to support. So this chapter provides a lot of detailed information. Some of it is a lot deeper than you're going to need most likely in your career. But I tried to hit for you the high points, the stuff that most of you will need. In reviewing what we talked about, there was a section on land use influencers. So again, these are real estate developers who are proposing change. In that group of top land use influencers is also local governments who are responsible for managing that change. And then you have community interest groups who typically are trying to stabilize things and stabilize change. After that, we then talked about different land use information systems. We talked about different ways of classifying land, and then we talked about these large spreadsheets where you would look at the type of land, the location, the amount, the constraints, and the cost, and all these different factors. Another way of classifying land is just visualizing the different classifications of land, from the more rural to the suburban to the urban, and that's using the urban transect model. We also talked about future land use analysis and the importance of developing scenarios in a land use planning process. And then through that, I gave you a detailed explanation of how you would create some capacity models and what the different things are that you would look at in that process. And then lastly, we went over what all the different types of indicators are, and then different ways of presenting that and when in the process you would present them. So good luck.